I want to welcome you to the Rabbinical Assembly's, the CJLS International Seminar for Halakhic Study. This is a project that the CJLS created several years ago as a way for us to come together as an international global community, all learning the same teshuvah, the same responsa. And we're so excited to be joined today by Rabbi Jane Kanarak, who is the Associate Dean for Academic Development and Advising and a Professor of Rabbinics at Hebrew College. The Associate Dean of Academic Development and Advising, yes, I gave you the whole title. She's also the author of The Biblical Narrative and the Formation of Rabbinic Law and the co-editor of Learning to Read Talmud, What It Looks Like and How It Happens, and Motherhood in the Jewish Cultural Imagination. And we are just so privileged to be able to learn from Rabbi Kanarak today, and you'll be able to ask questions throughout or at the end, and feel free if you have any technological needs to let me know as well. I'll put a link to the source sheet in the chat in just a moment. And with that, Rabbi Kanarak.
Thank you, Ilana, for the introduction. And it's really a treat to be here and to see your faces on Zoom. And thank you most of all for asking me to do this and for even featuring my tshuva in the International Day of Halakhic Study. Hopefully I got the title right. I'm also thrilled to know that my Pesach cleaning is done, that I've already done 2 Sidarim, another ritual I love to do, Seudat Miriam, and we're packing away all the dishes. Perfect. Okay, so with that nod to the magic of time that you just worked, Ilana, I'm going to jump into this. I want to start with a bit of my personal background and how I actually got to writing this tshuva. And I want to talk a little bit about the process of writing it, because that's really important in this topic. And then I'm going to dive into some of the source material, not all of the source material, but some of the source material. So that's the outline of where we are going today. So to start with myself, I was quite little. I don't remember exactly how old. Was I 4? Was I 6? Was I 8? But I have this memory of being at the Shabbat table, and my parents and my younger brother, he was 2.5 years younger than me, wearing a kippah. And I have this memory of saying to my father, well, if my brother's wearing a kippah, I want to too. And so my father, bless his heart, I grew up in Brookline, Mass. My father walked with me to the Israel bookstore and bought me a kippah. And I think it was green velvet with silver embroidery of Jewish stars. And I started wearing that kippah at Friday night dinner at my home. Now, you should also know that my family is South African. So for my father to actually say, sure, I'll take my girl to go get a kippah was a little bit transgressive. I don't remember how long I wore that kippah for, and I don't remember when I took it off. At some point, I stopped wearing it at Shabbat dinner. That might have had to do with a larger rebellion I was in against Hebrew school and those kinds of things. But at some point, I stopped wearing it. We still have it, though, at my parents' house. And since that time, I've had a continued ambivalence about head covering. And so when Danny Nevins asked me to write this tshuva, I said, this is a great chance for me to actually dive into that ambivalence and push myself a bit about that ambivalence and really see what's there. I've tried wearing it when I'm working at Camp Ramah. I've tried not wearing it. I've tried the full range. I've tried different kinds of head coverings. The ambivalence still sits with me. And so when I was asked to write this tshuva, I said, you know, why not? This is a practice that's hard for me. And I genuinely don't know what the answer is or should be in this practice. It was clear to me and has been clear to me for many years now, probably 25, 30 years for now, of wearing talit and tefillin. They are mitzvot. It was clear to me. Those go on me. There was never a question, but kippah was much more difficult. So that's part one of writing the tshuva. Why did I engage in this? I was asked to, and it's a practice that I have had questions about for a long time. Number two, I was particularly intrigued by writing this precisely because I did not know what the answer should be. One can go into a tshuva really suspecting, I know what the answer is, or I know what the answer should be. And in this case, I neither knew what the answer should be or what the answer actually is to the question. I knew that I wanted to be respectful towards the multiplicity of practices that women have around head covering in conservative synagogues. There are women that cover their hair, wear a kippah or a headband, I'll get to that in a moment, and have a deep commitment to egalitarian Judaism. There are women that do not wear a head covering and have a deep commitment to egalitarian Judaism nonetheless. And so when I wrote this tshuva, I wanted to find a way to respect both of those practices and to realize that asking people to put on clothing or change their clothing is loaded. And so that was really important to me to internalize as well. There is a lot of textual tradition on women and hair covering, not hair covering, I should cover it all, on hair covering. I also wanted to write this tshuva, not on women in hair covering, but women in head covering. So if you read the tshuva, you'll note I put all the hair covering stuff in one footnote. I said, nah, this is not what that's about. So I wanted to know what would happen if I looked in our textual tradition for passages that were about women and head covering, not hair covering, women in head covering that was not necessarily connected to marriage. So what would happen if I shifted the lens? And then as I started to dive, what I saw was I found sources that mentioned the practice of women wearing kippot. Obviously, these are not the kippot that we wear today, but nonetheless, I saw the word there in the Mishnah. And so I said, this is really intriguing. Again, could I uncover a textual tradition that actually had to do with women's practices and women's practices that had something to do with the kippah? In other words, my question was not, oh, can I just look what the sources say about men and then decide whether or not those apply to women? But can I actually find a textual tradition that might help guide women specifically about our practices of head covering? So I'm going to pause here and just say one other thing, because it's a question that I've gotten as well, which is I also want to recognize at this point that there are many folks who do not identify either as male or female and non-binary folks. And I made a conscious choice here to address women specifically because I was also curious, because there is a textual tradition there. And I wanted to say, if someone identifies particularly with a textual tradition about women, what might be opened up there? So that's the background to the tshuva. And now I'd like to actually jump into some of the sources. I'm going to pause at different places for questions, and there's also going to be space for questions at the end. Before I jump in, just one more thing. In writing any tshuva, there are not inevitable sources that one is led to that lead to an inevitable answer. Which sources you choose, what you emphasize, I use the word choose there, the sources itself, what I choose to write on and what I leave behind are also going to be part of shaping the answer. So in what we're going to do now, I'm going to share the source sheet. I think Ilana put a link for it in the chat. Ilana, can you also keep an eye on the chat for me and let me know if there's anything in particular I should pay attention to, because it's just hard to keep track of all of it. The source sheet does not have all of the sources that are in the tshuva on it. So I want to also just encourage you to read the tshuva as in full as well. It has a big chunk of them, but it doesn't have all of them, just because I thought that would become too overwhelming to go through every single source in the tshuva. But I really want to encourage you to look at the tshuva as a whole and read it. Okay, so now I'm going to transition with that intro into the source sheet itself, and I'm going to share screen. Okay. Let me just. And I am just going to move you all back to the center of my screen and turn you into boxes that are more to my liking for seeing all of you. Hold on. It's a whole process with Zoom, as I have learned. I'm also going to apologize. I'm teaching in my work office and my camera is set up. I'm not using the extra camera, which means I have to look up a little to the source sheet instead of straight ahead at all of you, which is how I have my setup at home, but it's just not as well set up at work, unfortunately, yet. So I apologize if I look like I'm looking up a little instead of straight at you. It's just tough. Okay, great. So I'm going to actually talk first about part one, my textual tradition here, and why this is here on the source sheet. And I'm going to do this also so if you teach this, you have a framework for understanding the setup and why the sheet is like this. I believe that head covering is a loaded topic. And it triggers a lot of feelings for people, precisely because it is deeply about personal practice and it's public. You can't hide whether or not you are or you are not engaging in head covering. So at the beginning of this shiur, when I've done it, I think I've done it a couple times, I like to give people 5 minutes to actually write about their own practice of head covering or uncovering, a time for them to surface, why do they do what they do? What do they do? What do they do? And how do they feel about it? And then I want people to be able to connect their own practice of head covering to head covering, uncovering in their own community. In other words, what we do as individuals is also tied up with a larger communal context and choice. I've also set this up so it can be done in Chavruta. It does not have to be, but if you want to match with Chavrutot, I think it's really lovely when two people can share with each other about their writing. What is their own practice of head covering and uncovering, and even sharing with their Chavruta their questions about head covering, uncovering in your community. It's my way of hopefully moving people out of feeling doctrinaire and feeling reactive or defensive about what they do or do not do, and also a way for us to hear one another about our practices. I also like to I called it your textual tradition. It's not really your textual tradition, it's your practiced one, but because you're writing it down, it becomes your own textual tradition. And so in that way, my hope is that each of us can be in dialogue with ourselves and with the tradition that we've inherited from our ancient, medieval, and contemporary forebears. I find that to be really, really crucial when we're doing halakha, is both engaging in the practice of letting myself speak to the texts, but also finding a way to open up so that the text can speak to me and influence me and create a two-way conversation. I want to say these were just amazing. And I think for a practice like head covering, which is so much in the realm of minhag, to actually have our narratives, part of what helps to shape halakha here is really crucial. And you're going to see that peeking out in some of the sources that we look at. So with no further ado, I'm going to jump into our textual sources from our tradition. We're going to start, I'm going to share my screen once again, hopefully this will, okay, great. So sorry, before I do that, I just need to rearrange you into the position I like to have you when I'm teaching. Okay, great. All the manipulations with Zoom that I've had to learn. Okay, we are going to start with Mishnah Nedarim, which does not actually mention kippah at all, but it's going to set it up. So here it is. Hanoder mishchorei arosh asor bekerchin uveva'alei sevot umutar banashim uvaktanim she'ein nikra'im shchorei rosh ela anashim. He who vows not to benefit from the black-haired may not benefit from the bald or the gray-haired, but may benefit from women and children, because only men are called black-haired. Now, I'm not going to get into all of the determinants of vows here, because what I care about here is that the Mishnah calls men black-haired and does not call women and children by that term. I don't even know totally what black-headed or black-haired means here. Okay, so we are going to go from there into Talmud Bavli, into Masechet Nedarim, and the commentary on Mishnah Nedarim, fittingly enough. So here is what the Bavli does. The Bavli wants to know, what is the reason that the Mishnah only calls men black-headed or black-haired and not women? Why does it use that terminology in classic Bavli word, my tama? And the answer it gives is because men, sometimes they cover their heads and sometimes they uncover their heads, but women always cover their heads and minors always uncover their heads. Nashim le'olam mikasu, ktanim le'olam migalu. That's the language that's used. So what is interesting to me here for our discussion about head covering in the Bavli's interpretation of the Mishnah? What is intriguing to me is that this Mishnah says that women always cover their heads. It doesn't name a particular garment. And it says men, sometimes they do, sometimes they don't, but women always do, and minors always uncover their heads. So there are a couple things that I learned from this. One is that head covering of some point is a practice of women and is not necessarily a practice of males. The other thing is that it is associated with age. So minors, and it seems to be male and female minors, have uncovered heads. Once you get to be a woman of a certain age, I have no idea what that age is, but I like that phrase, a woman of a certain age, you would then be wearing a head covering, some form of a head covering, okay? So that's the first source, is from Bavli Nedarim, that men and women are distinguished one from the other by women of a certain age, whatever that is, having a constant practice of head covering and men not, okay? Great. And that's why in the question, I said, pay attention to gender and age here. And that's part of what I want people to notice from this passage. I'm going to go back from the Bavli now to the Tosefta. So I'm going to go to a Tannaitic text again, just as the Mishnah was a Tannaitic text. So text from around, somewhere around the year 200 of the Common Era. And I really love this window into the ancient world. Lokhin min hanashim klei tzemer b'Yehuda, ve'en lokhin perot yenot shmanim uslatot, lo min hanashim ve'lo min ha'avadim ve'lo min ha'ktanim. Abba Shaul omer, lokhin min ha'isha b'chamisha dinarim, kedei shetikach bahen kippah lirosha. One may purchase from women wool garments in Judea, but one may not purchase fruits, wines, oils, or flowers from either women or slaves or minors. Abba Shaul says one may purchase fruits, wines, oils, and flowers from a woman for 5 dinars in order that she may purchase a kippah for her head with them. So there are a couple things that I want to emphasize in this text. First of all, it uses the word kippah to describe whatever garment it is that a woman puts on her head. This clearly is not the kippah, either the sruga or the velvet or the lace or the wire, all the different things that we call by the name kippah today. I don't know what it looks like, but I think I can make a good guess that it doesn't look like the things that we call kippah today. Nevertheless, it is the term that the Tosefta uses for what a woman puts on her head. Number 2, it uses the word kippah lirosha. It does not use the word hair, but it is a kippah that she puts on her head. Number 3, I already said 2. Number 3 is that she is actually purchasing the kippah, right? Abba Shaul gives this exemption and says, actually, you can purchase fruits, wines, oils, and flowers. Perhaps they use a man, I don't know, for a woman for this specified amount of money so that she will be able to buy this garment called the kippah to wear, So of course, I was totally intrigued because our Mishnah from Nadarim didn't give a name to the garment that a woman would wear on her head, but this Tosefta does. So one of the things I'm always interested in Halakha is also what are the sources that are there that are overlooked. So we've spent all this time talking about kippah for females as a form of head covering. And at least I did not presume that there was such a thing in our ancient sources, but nevertheless, here it is. So here's an act of revealing and uncovering something that is there but has been hidden. Okay, great. Now what I want to turn to is one more Tannaitic source. This one's from Mishnah Ketubot. So again, we're hanging out with the Tanaim somewhere around the year 200 of the Common Era. And these are a list of requirements that a husband has to provide his wife. Totally striking. And her husband, gives her a bed, a mat of reeds, and matting. And he gives her a kippah for her head. In the Hebrew, v'notein la kippah l'rosha. He also gives her a belt for her loins, shoes that will last from one festival to the next, and clothing worth 50 zuz that will last from 1 year to the next. And then it continues, and he does not give her new clothing in the dry season and worn out garments for the rainy season. Rather, he gives her clothing worth 50 zuz in the rainy season, and she clothes herself with worn out ones in the dry season, and the older worn out garments are hers. So again, here in this source from the Mishnah, you see that this woman is wearing a kippah on her head, and it is called a kippah. And again, it's not associated with hair, but something that she puts on her head. Obviously, she probably has hair there. But again, for the purposes of halakha, I am struck that it is termed a gift that he gives her as kippah l'rosha. Two, you can see here, it is something that the husband is obligated to make sure that he gives his wife. And you can also see that the kippah is listed with a range of other clothing, right? A belt and shoes and clothing that's appropriate for the dry season and the rainy season, and how much that clothing needs to be worth. So here, there's not a mention of age here, but I would assume we're at least zeroing in that the kippah is something that it's not something that a child wears. It's an obligation of the husband to the wife. And from the fact that it's listed with all of these others of items of clothing, I would say that in the Mishnah, the kippah doesn't have ritual significance, right? It's not connected with Shema or Tefillah or anything like that. It is a piece of her clothing, just like a belt, just like something else she would wear. It is a piece of her clothing, okay? So that is, those are our Tannaitic texts. I'm giving you just a couple of texts from the Bavli on this sheet. As I went over this, I said, oh, there were a few more I should have put in from the tshuva. So Chata'ai ani maskeret, something like that, but you can read the tshuva and see them. So I'm going to start with this one from the Bavli. And this is one of the more, I like to say famous, but really it's famous in certain limited circles of which we are all a part, that's often used as a basis for male head covering. But it's really important so we can start to think about the different ways that the Bavli talks about male and female head covering. So here is what Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi says. Amar Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi, Asur la'adam shehalech arba amot b'koma zekufa, shne'amar milo kol ha'aretz kivodo. So said Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi, a person, and it's probably a man here, I should have tweaked that translation, is forbidden to walk 4 amot, 4 cubits, in an upright posture. As it says, the earth is full of his glory. Rav Huna bre de Rav Yehoshua, lo misage arba amot begilui harosh. Amar shchina lemala miroshi. Rav Huna, the son of Rav Yehoshua, would not walk 4 cubits with an uncovered head. He said, the Shechina is above my head. So let me unpack this for a moment. We open with this tradition from Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi that a person is forbidden to walk 4 amot in an upright posture. And the proof text is the earth is full of God's glory. Melo haaretz kevodo. How is God's kavod imagined here? God's kavod is actually imagined as a physical presence of God on earth. So if I were to walk in an upright posture, I would actually bump into God, maybe God's proverbial feet. If you want to know more about this, Ben Summers has done really great work on God's kavod as also a physical presence. And so what is Rav Huna, the son of Rav Yehoshua, in response to this idea of God filling the earth? He had the practice of not walking 4 cubits with an uncovered head. And he would say, the Shekhinah is above my head. So here in this text from the Bavli, you can see male head covering coming through as a sign of piety. Rav Huna would not walk 4 cubits with an uncovered head because the Shekhinah was above him. Note again that the phrase in the Hebrew is Gilui Harosh. We're not using the form kippah here or something like that, but he had a practice of making sure that his head was covered because the Shekhinah was above him. Contrast this, depressingly enough, with, I'm just seeing if there's one other thing that I want to put in here. No, it's okay. Contrast this with Bereshit Rabbah and how it explains a woman going out with her head covered. And it asks, Mipnei ma ha'ish yotze v'rosho mikuleh v'ha'isha yotza v'rosha mechuseh amar lahem le'echad she'avar avera v'hu mitbayesh mibnei adam lefikach hi yotza mechusa. Why does a man go out and his head is uncovered and a woman goes out and her head is covered? He said to them, this may be compared to one who commits a transgression and is ashamed before people. Therefore, she goes out with her head covered. So this is Bereshit Rabbah, this classical midrash from probably around the 5th century, explaining why most men uncover their head. They're free of transgression. And then a woman goes out and her head is covered. And it is a marker of shame. So I do like to highlight what is less also beautiful in our tradition as we are actually going through these sources as well. So when, and maybe it's a reference to Chava, to Eve and her sin, but this is what Bereshit Rabbah actually says. So I'm going to sum up the Talmudic material. If you're interested, there is more in the tshuva, but this is what I actually put on on this source sheet. So in the Talmud, it seems that female head covering is simply everyday adult woman's garb. It is not ritual garb, but it is everyday adult woman's garb. It is important enough that it is an obligation of the husband to the wife to provide it and to make sure that a woman who is a merchant can earn enough money in order to buy it for herself. For males, it seems that the majority of males went with an uncovered head, and that some form of a head covering was a sign of piety, of extra piety. Note also that Bereshit Rabbah ascribes a particular reason of shame to a woman's covering her head and a man uncovering. I also just want to note going forward that you might already have in your head, isn't that so interesting? Because somehow we've gotten to a place today where head covering is normative for males, but not normative within the liberal Jewish world for females. So I want to just note that fascinating arc. We're quite far away from the Talmudic period, but the way in which it's been flipped, I'm going to use a bad pun on its head. Okay. I'm just going to go forward since we had that blip. Normally I would have paused for questions here, but I'm going to go forward into a Gaonic passage. So we're moving now from the Bavli, one might even say more historical sources, but we're moving from Talmudic sources and the Talmudic period a little later into a Gaonic text called Masechet Sofrim, Tractate Scribes. And the source I'm about to read is one of the key sources for head covering in general. It's been read usually as a key source for male head covering, but not only. And this is where we're going to start moving the trajectory into Psak Halakha, okay? One of the questions that I went into with these sources that I'm about to do is the question of, do we have to read them about males, or might they be about males and females as well at the same time? As we read these next sources, I want you to notice that they function along 3 different axes, okay? They function along an axis of kavod hatzibor, the honor of the congregation. They function along an axis of yirat shamayim, fear of heaven, so the piety axis. And they function along also the category of Jewish distinctiveness. So those are going to be the 3 anchors that move through these sources. Kavod hatzibor, the honor of the congregation, yirat shamayim, fear of heaven, piety, and Jewish distinctiveness. How do we mark ourselves as different from other people? So that's part of what you're going to be looking for here. Okay, so from Masechet Sofrim, a minor reads Torah and translates, but he does not read Shema. In the original, it's aval eno poreset Shema, but he does not read Shema in order to say the prayer Yotzer Or. And he does not pass before the ark, act as prayer leader, and he does not raise his hands in the priestly blessing. So the first section of this is delineating what a minor may and may not do as a prayer leader. He can't read, he reads Torah and translates, but he can't do this thing of porei sal Shema, which here I just said was not read Shema in order to say the prayer Yotzer Or. He can't be the full Shaliach Tzibor, and he can't offer, I didn't even know how to do it, I'm not a Kohen, he can't offer the priestly blessing. Okay, now we move on to a person who is not a minor. One who has holes in his garments, whose knees are visible or his clothes are ripped, or one whose head is uncovered leads Shema. So you can see why this is going to be important. So a person who has holes in his garments where you can see the knees, clothes are ripped, or one whose head is uncovered can actually lead Shema, according to Masechet Sofrim. We may not want the kids at Camp Ramah to see that opinion, but it's right there. And there are those that say, with his knees visible and his clothes ripped, he leads Shema, but with his head uncovered, it is not permissible for him to utter God's name. So here is the alternative position. This is what's important in Sofrim. The first position is your head is uncovered, you can lead Shema. The second opinion is you can lead Shema if your clothes are ripped, but if your head is uncovered, you are forbidden from leading Shema because it's not permissible for a person to utter God's name with an uncovered head. Either way, he may translate, but he does not read from the Torah, and he does not pass before the ark as prayer leader, and he does not raise his hands in the priestly blessing. So where do we get to at the end? Position 1 permits Shema with an uncovered head. Position 2 forbids a person from leading Shema with an uncovered head. But everyone agrees that a person must have a covered head when reading from the Torah, when acting as prayer leader. So that would be, I think, covering the Amidah, covering the standing prayer, when reading from the Torah and reciting Birkat Kohanim. One reason, so I'll actually, one reason that these last rituals, in particular being the prayer leader or reading from the Torah, may require a covered head, according to Masechet Sofrim, is that they are public. In the ancient world, the Shema could have been led from where the person was sitting. So you wouldn't actually get up in front of the congregation. So that might be a reason that Masechet Sofrim is differentiating between Shema and Tefillah, that is the leading of the Amidah here. Okay, so that is our classical source. I'm going to switch from there. I'm going down to 9 first. And I want to read you a source that actually is a classically was used to actually justify women receiving aliyot. But I'm going to use for kippah and to talk about women's head covering. So here's the Shulchan Aruch. We're switching to the 16th century and its reading of that source in a sense. So I'll count for the number 7 for reading from the Torah on Shabbat. Even a woman and a minor who understands for whom one blesses. So even a woman and a minor can receive an aliyah in shorthand. But the sages said, a woman should not publicly read from the Torah because of the honor of the congregation. And now we have the Haggah, the comment of Moshe Isserles of the Ramah. And what does he say? He says, and it is forbidden to read from the Torah with an uncovered head. So why do I love this source for the purposes of this tshuva? The reason I love this is because at the beginning of this statement, Caro says, everyone counts for 7, even a woman and a minor. And then the sages come in and say, no, women shouldn't do it because of the honor of the congregation. When the Ramah comes in, he just simply says, and it's forbidden to read from the Torah with an uncovered head. He doesn't differentiate between males and females. It's as if the Ramah is saying, hey, whether you're male or female and you're reading from the Torah, what you need to have is a covered head. So that's where I take this 16th century comment of Isserles building on Caro is whoever reads from the Torah needs to have a covered head. That's number 1. There is another source which seems to lean the other way, but that again, you can read about in the tshuva. I'm going to go from here. I'm going to go back to source 8, and I'm going to go to the Mishnah Torah, to the world of Maimonides. And here I'm switching actually from congregational prayer to individual prayer. Rambam is obviously addressing himself to men. I think that's very clear here. However, my question is, does he have to be? Do we have to read him that in that limited a way? I'm actually not going to prescribe. I'm going to open the question. So Rambam is talking about preparing one's clothes for prayer. He says, how must one prepare one's clothes for prayer? He prepares his clothing first and adorns himself and glorifies himself, as it says, bow down to the Lord, glorious in holiness. And when we not stand in prayer in his undershirt and not with a bare head and not with bare feet, if the way of that place is not to stand barefoot before nobility, but to wear shoes. So here Rambam is specifically not talking about Shema, he's talking about Tefillah. It's Mishnah Torah, Hilchot Tefillah, the laws of Tefillah. And he says that an individual reciting the Amidah, the standing prayer, must have a covered head. In other words, you can't stand there with a bare head. That's Rambam and his dress code, okay? So let's switch down to the Shulchan Aruch now, which is source 10, and I'm just checking my sheets to make sure that this is the way I want it to go. Yes, so this is what he says. The Shulchan Aruch says, a person should not stand to recite the Amidah with his money bag, an uncovered head, or bare feet, if the manner of the people of the place is only to stand before important people wearing shoes. So again, you can see the Shulchan Aruch, he's following right after Rambam, and he is saying, if you're reciting the Amidah, one should have a covered head. Yes. Again, I assume that he is talking about males, but again, since we know that the obligation to recite the Amidah falls equally as much on females as it does on males, I don't see why one couldn't actually read this source more expansively as applying to males and females. I'm going to switch. And again, just to name the principles here, we seem to have Kavod Tzibor showing up here, and we also seem to have Yirat Shamayim as concerns. I'm going to switch now to a commentary on the Shulchan Aruch. And this is going to take us to the other axis, which is that of being different than other people. This is a commentary of the Taz on Orach Chaim 8:3. And he is writing in 16th, 17th century Poland. And it appears to me that there is a strict prohibition We haven't seen anyone else say there's a strict prohibition. So Isor Gamor, this is the first time we're really seeing that language concerning uncovering one's head for another reason. And that is because it is now a law among the Gentiles, that as soon as they sit down, they always remove their hats. And if so, this is included in the rule and do not follow their laws. All the more so in this rule, which has a reason, because covering one's head teaches about the fear of heaven, as in the passage at the end of Tractate Shabbat. So what does the Taz say? First of all, he switches to Isor Gamor. And now you can see we've turned the Talmud on its head. And he's saying that, oh, Gentiles remove their hats as soon as they sit down. So if we're going to be different than them, we need to keep our heads covered. And then he uses uvachukoteim lo telechu. And he also has another reason, which actually I heard in many of your comments about why you wear a kippah, is because covering one's head teaches about the fear of heaven. So here you can see difference and fear of heaven coming in the Taz's comment. Again, I think that he is primarily talking about men, but I want you to see how the need to be different is coming up here in this passage. I'm skipping a lot of time, but this is one of my favorite sources. This is from Ovadia Yosef. There is actually quite a strong Sephardic tradition, as I discovered, of females covering their head. Now, this may be because head covering lasted long in Islamic countries, I'm not sure, but Ovadia Yosef has two different shuvot on head coverings for females. And I'm going to give you an excerpt from it because it really runs through all of the themes that we've seen. So this is what he says. Therefore, single girls, na'arot revakot, single girls for whom it would be difficult to cover their heads whenever they utter God's name in verses or in blessings, it should say, leave them based upon the essence of the law. So he opens up and he says, look, single girls for whom it would be difficult to cover their heads, it's too much, leave them, because there is a basis in the law for them being uncovered. If we think back to Masechet Sofrim, to Tractate Sofrim, we saw that there's a whole position that you can have your head uncovered. However, while this reason is correct, not to prevent with strength those women who are lenient in this matter, because they have on what to rely, in any case, it appears that a priori it is fitting to teach also single girls to cover their heads when they recite blessings, and all the more so when they pray the Shmona Esrei, because even according to Rambam, it is necessary to be stringent in this. So if we look what he's saying, he's saying, you don't go and slam a kippah on the head of females who aren't used to it. They have on what to rely. There is a basis to be lenient. In other words, not wearing a kippah for Ovadia Yosef is the lenient position. But what should we be doing? What should we be teaching? We should be teaching single girls to cover their heads, not only when they recite the Shmona Esrei, which they should be doing, as we saw in the Rambam, but even when they recite blessings. And now and thus ruled the great and holy Rabbi Matzliach Mazuz, may his memory be for a blessing, in his response to Ish Matzliach, that one should teach that even single girls should cover their heads when they bless and pray, or when they read the Tanakh, or when they utter God's name, and that thus was the custom in the Eastern lands. And thus raised the great Rabbi Ovadia Hedaya, may his name be a blessing. And it is a holy obligation upon the heads and directors of the Beis Yaakov schools to stand at the guard and to teach the students of the school to cover their heads when they pray and bless and read from the Tanakh, and at the least when they pray. And the words of the sages are heard through pleasantness, so that they should find an attentive ear to their words, and may they raise blessing from God. This is a pretty amazing source. He's both saying this is the ideal. There is an ideal of head covering for girls, not hair covering, but head covering from girls. But nevertheless, there is a basis for not having a head covering. So while Ovadia Yosef, wants teachers to educate their students towards wearing head coverings, he also affirms that it may be too difficult for some to do. It's as if he's encoded and recognized both practices in this tshuva. So where does that lead me? And I know we need to wrap up, and I'm sorry about the technological malfunction here. Where this leads me is the following. Talmudic literature describes adult females as wearing head coverings. They're essential to women's clothing, but they don't seem to have any particular ritual significance. Medieval Halakhic literature knows head covering for the sake of kavod hatzibur and head covering for the sake of yirat shamayim. So a man who's reading from the Torah, acting as prayer leader, reciting the priestly blessing should cover his head. But a man who's not acting in any of these roles, it seems like from medieval literature, doesn't actually need to cover his head. It's only when you're actually leading the congregation. The Talmud and codes do permit women to be one of the 7 who read from the Torah. And I would also argue there that, like males, they would then require the woman to actually have her hair covered. For individual prayer, Rambam and the Shulchan Aruch require head covering for the Amidah in particular, not necessarily the Shema, and for other ritual practices as well. But for the purposes of this tshuva, I want to focus on the Amidah. And Ovadia Yosef says that all females should cover their heads while reciting the Amidah, and ideally blessings as well. Beyond the Amidah, though, what I discovered was that our opinions are divided, even in the case of male head covering. And so consistent head covering, it seems to me, is a matter of piety and of not ever reciting God's name with an uncovered head. So where does that bring me? And I'm just going to read you a final paragraph from my tshuva and then the psak halacha that I came to with the help of the law committee. The contemporary practice of female head covering reflects this fluidity in the textual and customary situation of female head covering. On the one hand, reflecting a sense of head covering as a fitting prayer garment, increasing numbers of girls and women are wearing some type of head covering in synagogue. As I remarked at the beginning of this tshuva, which you have not read, some women and girls choose to wear a kippah, others a headband, and still others a hat. With the exception of the kippah, the scarf and the hat do not serve as markers of Jewish identity and distinctiveness. To many within the Jewish community, though, they do operate as internal markers of affiliation, particularly when worn outside of the synagogue. Note, I can walk along the street and have a pretty good guess when someone is wearing a headband as a sign of piety and Jewish affiliation. On the other hand, reflecting the differing opinions and practices about head covering, many women still choose not to cover their heads at any time. Both head covering and uncovering thus have textual and customary basis. And I felt that this situation makes psak halacha both difficult and aspirational. In other words, while we may name an ideal, we also need to recognize the care and thoughtfulness that needs to be involved in implementing any halachic change. Rather than making fiat declarations, we encourage our communities to listen to the voices of girls and women, both those that already do engage in practices of head covering and those do not. So here was my psak halacha, with a big thank you to the CJLS for helping me to get here. We really picked apart the wording quite carefully before we came to this psak halacha. Because women and girls' customary practice is increasingly moving in the direction of head covering in synagogue, and because the textual tradition leans toward requiring women's head covering, we advocate the following practices. 1, women and girls should cover their heads when reading from the Torah and when receiving an aliyah. 2, in deference to kavod hatzibur, women and girls should cover their heads when acting as prayer leader. 3, when praying Shachrit, Mincha, or Mariv as an individual, women and girls should cover their heads at least when reciting the Amidah, and ideally during the entire prayer service. 4, head covering at other times is a matter of personal piety, and a woman or girl may cover her hair with a garment of her choice. That garment need not publicly identify her as a Jew. So that was the psak. It was really a pleasure to work on this. Again, mostly, as I said, because I had no idea where I was going to come out at the end. And also because it's always just a joy to find what's hidden and to get pushed myself by both other people's practices and by our tradition. So I want to thank all of you with apologies for the technical difficulties, which are going to make the back end, which means that we're out of time. But I really want to say thank you to Rabbi Garber for inviting me, and thanks to all of you for coming.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Kanarek. It was lovely to be able to learn from you, and especially as we're approaching and or depending on when you watch this, past the 100th anniversary of the first girls becoming a bat mitzvah in North America. Judith Kaplan just on March 18th of 1922. So to think about how far we've come and how lovely it is to be able to learn from a woman about women's piety and to be able to share with it. And as I think I remarked in the comments, all of our stories about head covering are just unbelievably powerful. So thank you for teaching us. Thank you for being here, everyone. And I hope that you'll continue to teach this and to celebrate the process of halakha within our movement. So be well, everyone. And again, Yishar Kochech. Thank you all so much.